I was going to respond to this comment in text, but the comment got too long and I ended up splitting it into multiple parts. So instead of leaving this as a series of long comments, I've decided to make a shorter video responding to the poster's claims. And by shorter video, what I mean is I made a half-hour long video. Whoops. We have 3 copies of the works of Tacitus, the earliest of which is 800 years after Tacitus wrote. So what? Are you suggesting that because Tacitus wrote about Christians later, that somehow makes the New Testament more reliable by being written earlier? That's not how historical reliability works. The age of work does not on its own dictate reliability. This is a false equivalence. Tacitus was documenting political and historical events, not supernatural phenomenon. As Carl Sagan famously put it, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and a text age or manuscript count doesn't magically meet that bar. Otherwise, I'd have to accept the Odyssey as equally real as the New Testament. You're engaging in the tu quoque fallacy, essentially saying, well, if you trust Tacitus, you have to trust the New Testament too. And that's not how modern historiography works. Historical sources are assessed individually based on content, corroboration, and context, not on symmetrical loyalty. This makes me wonder, do you actually know what Tacitus wrote? Because many apologists seem to cite him without having read or understood the passage. Tacitus Annals, 1544. Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origins, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. Let's break this down carefully, because citing Tacitus as evidence for Christianity's truth claims is a move that backfires spectacularly when you actually read what he wrote. First, Tacitus confirms something unremarkable, that Christians existed and believed their founder had been executed. That's not surprising. Christians exist today, so their presence in the past isn't exactly a groundbreaking revelation. Second, while suffered the extreme penalty is generally understood as a euphemism for crucifixion, a common Roman punishment for insurrection and slaves, it doesn't confirm the method, motive, or narrative context provided by the Gospels. Furthermore, it's unclear whether Tacitus was independently verifying that Christus was executed or merely reporting that Christians themselves claimed his execution. Most scholars lean towards the latter, seeing it as a report of belief, not as a confirmation of fact. Tacitus's passage confirms that Christians existed, that they were scapegoated by Nero for the Great Fire of Rome, and that they believed their founder had been executed under Pilate. But in terms of historical methodology, it doesn't verify the truth of their claims, only the existence of their belief. Even if Tacitus is referencing Roman records, which we have no evidence for in this passage, that would only establish that someone named Christus was executed, not that he performed miracles, rose from the dead, or fulfilled divine prophecy. It's a mundane footnote in a world full of would-be executed messiahs. Let's not forget, Tacitus outright called Christianity a most mischievous superstition and described it as evil. If you're citing him as a star witness for your faith, you might want to reread the whole quote first. That's not exactly the ringing endorsement you think it is. By the way, I want to clarify my position. I am not a mythicist, at least not entirely. In this context, mythicism is the view that Jesus Christ was a completely fabricated character with no historical basis whatsoever. That's not where I stand. I lean towards the view that there likely was an apocalyptic Jewish preacher, possibly a rabbi, who lived around the time Jesus is said to have lived. In my view, he gained a following centered on end times prophecy, and as his movement grew and began to attract political attention, it ran afoul of Roman authorities, who, in keeping with their usual approach to potential agitators, had him executed to reinforce state control, as they traditionally did with almost every rebel. Yes, this means that I hold the position that Jesus was likely crucified. That's an unpopular opinion among my fellow atheists, but historically, crucifixion was the go-to method for punishing political dissidents. So yeah, I think Jesus was real, and I think Rome nailed him to a cross. I also think this is no big deal. I mean, it likely really sucked for Jesus, but I think it's way more mundane than people give the notion credit for. The idea that Jesus being crucified is somehow significant only stems from cultural bias in the modern Christian world and is not significant at all in the historical Roman context. What I do consider mythological are the supernatural claims: turning water into wine, ascending into heaven, curing the blind, being the literal Son of God, etc. To me, these are post hoc theological embellishments, likely born from oral traditions trying to amplify his reputation over time, and from later writers inventing stories to elevate their own theological agendas and secure influence within early Christianity. So, why do I think this? Well, when you look at the historical backdrop of Jesus' life, he likely lived during a time of growing social and political unrest in Roman occupied Palestine, a period where many Jewish communities were becoming increasingly aware that Roman rule was not in their best interests. After all, the Bible, especially the Gospels, is steeped in anti Roman subtext. I think Jesus was, in a way, the ancient equivalent of going viral. His message arrived at the perfect moment: a population disillusioned with imperial occupation, primed for an apocalyptic hope, and craving a leader who could speak to that discontent. His words resonated, spread fast, and attracted attention, and not just from the crowd, but from the authorities. To the Roman state, any movement that gathered mass appeal and hinted at kingship, even a spiritual one, was a potential uprising waiting to happen. Rome did not wait for that to happen. To maintain control and stop massive bloodshed before things spiraled, they did what they always did to would-be messiahs. They crucified him. Okay, back to the rest of the comment. Tacitus wrote about events that were 100 years before he was writing. Ancient historians routinely wrote about events that occurred centuries before they were born. Sure, writing about past events was normal, but again, Tacitus was analyzing emperors and military campaigns, not resurrections. Ancient historiography varied wildly in quality. Saying they all wrote about the past does not magically equalize the reliability of every ancient text. We have to take not only the work itself into account, but also the context in which it is written, as well as the surrounding historical and archaeological evidence. Tacitus, by and large, has far more evidential support than the Bible does. Remember, Tacitus was a Roman senator with access to official Roman records. He was a high-ranking political officer, including holding the title proconsul of Asia and senator, giving him access to senatorial archives, imperial records, and first-hand political accounts. By the way, this helps my case for the stating that the crucifixion of Jesus was mundane, if it happened at all. The earth didn't split, the sky didn't open, and nothing miraculously happened, because if Tacitus' writing is to be taken at face value, Jesus' death was just a footnote in some Roman archive somewhere. If something miraculous happened, you'd think someone would have at least made a note of it in the margins somewhere. Anyway, this point is important because Tacitus' position was so high in the imperial chain of command, his work wasn't hearsay from the street. It often relied on internal state documentation and elite informants. In his own writings, Tacitus explicitly contrasts trustworthy and untrustworthy sources, often noting where he relied on official documentation versus rumor. Additionally, Tacitus' writings often align with other sources, such as Suetonius, Pliny the Younger, Josephus, and Cassius Dio. His depictions of Nero, Domitian, and the Great Fire of Rome, for example, are mostly consistent with other Roman and Jewish sources. While these authors' interpretations often disagree, the overlap in factual chronology gives Tacitus reliability weight. We also have archaeological corroboration. Many of the places, events, and figures Tacitus described have been confirmed through archaeology. The Great Fire of Rome left archaeological layers of burned material in affected parts of the city. Tacitus' mention of Pontius Pilate aligns with the Pilate stone discovered in 1961 in Caesarea, confirming Pilate's role as the prefect of Judea. His accounts of imperial building projects, provincial assignments, and battles are consistent with military archaeology and epigraphic inscriptions. In histories and annals, the described campaigns and imperial successions are confirmed by coins, statues, and inscriptions like those in the Res Gestat Divi Augusti. I don't know how to pronounce that, I'm sorry. Now, I do want to emphasize that the Bible does have its own set of archaeological evidence as well. I won't gloss over the fact that the Bible has been used to corroborate the discovery of ancient cities and villages, as well as some of the more specific locations, but the difference is in the level of inaccuracy in the Bible. There's a lot in the Bible that is provably, empirically wrong. In the Old Testament, The Exodus did not happen. Even conservative scholarship agrees that a movement of this scale, around 600,000 Israelites allegedly wandering the desert for 40 years, did not happen. It would have left behind some archaeological evidence of such a mass migration, but no campsites, no graves, or more importantly, no destruction layers support it. The walls of Jericho didn't fall miraculously. Archaeological evidence proves that Jericho was already in ruins during the supposed time of conquest. Kathleen Kenyon's excavations found no evidence of inhabited Jericho during Joshua's era. The global flood is absolute anti-scientific nonsense. The earth was not covered completely in water. We are not all inbred descendants of a single man. I mean, even considering the geological and archaeological evidence is such a waste of my time discussing this. There are no sedimentary layers that exist to support the notion of a global flood. Civilizations like the Egyptians, Sumerians, Chinese all show continuous records through the alleged flood period. The global flood is bonkers levels of insane. And I know this isn't polite discourse and this video could get pulled way off track, but young earth creationism, especially in modern America, is extremely racist. The United David Solomon monarchy provably did not exist, period. A massive kingdom centered in Jerusalem under David and Solomon could not have existed. There is no evidence of a political center of power during the alleged reign. Jerusalem at the time was a small hill town, not a vast empire. There's no monumental architecture or inscriptions from 10th century BCE that match the biblical grandeur. Now, for the New Testament, the census of Quirinius could not have happened the way it's recorded in the Gospel of Luke. The claim is that Jesus was born during a Roman census conducted under Quirinius while Herod the Great was still king, but that timeline doesn't work. Herod died in 4 BCE, and Quirinius' census occurred in 6 CE, a full decade later. There's no historical overlap. If the New Testament were historically reliable at the detail level, the most basic political facts, like who governed and when, should at least line up. And the census itself, it makes no administrative sense. There's no historical precedent for requiring citizens to return to the towns of their distant ancestors. Roman censuses were conducted to count residents where they lived for the purposes of taxation and conscription, not ancestral hometown registration. This detail makes far more sense as the product of oral tradition, where theological symbolism and tribal identity mattered more than bureaucratic realism. For a culture with strong ancestral ties, having Jesus born in Bethlehem, city of David, was a way to fulfill prophecy and anchor the story in sacred geography, not historical accuracy. The massacre of the innocents, where Matthew claims that King Herod ordered the execution of all boys under the age of 2 in Bethlehem, is seriously undermined by the complete lack of historical evidence, most notably Josephus, who painstakingly chronicled Herod's reign and detailed numerous acts of brutality, including the execution of his own family, says nothing about such a massacre. A story that dramatic with such high emotional and political stakes going undimensioned by every other ancient source is a red flag. It strongly suggests narrative invention, not historical memory. It fits the mold of the "he's the kind of person that would do that" sentiment rather than a documented event, i.e., plausibility bias. It's like the viral AI-generated video of RFK Jr. saying something outrageous. People bought into it not because they had evidence, but because it felt plausible, based on what they already believed about him. But plausibility isn't proof, and once investigated, the video was easily revealed to be a fake. Herod was brutal, no doubt about it, but acknowledging that doesn't justify accepting every sensational story about him, especially when there's zero supporting evidence. That's not historical reasoning, that's confirmation bias in narrative form. And just to be clear, I am in no way defending or endorsing RFK Jr. In my view, he is one of the worst, most unqualified people to ever hold position of U.S. Secretary of Health, and his tenure is already proving to be a danger to public trust and well-being. The darkness at the crucifixion, as described in Luke, simply could not have happened. This wasn't just a cloudy day, it's portrayed in Luke as a mysterious darkness falling over the land, a supernatural event. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon, for the sun stopped shining. And yet, it's not recorded anywhere else. A phenomenon that extraordinary, darkness over the land in the middle of the day, would have made its way into Roman, Greek, Egyptian, or Jewish records. These cultures documented eclipses, comets, and omens with great care, and there's nothing, no eclipse, no natural anomaly, no mention at all. Even if someone had casually scribbled down, hey, it got weirdly dark this afternoon, but then it cleared up, would at least be something. But there's no record, no corroboration, and no reason to believe this story is anything more than literary flourish, a symbolic moment added to dramatize a theological point. Also, speaking of things that were not recorded by historians, the resurrection of the saints in Matthew? Listen to me. Dead people did not come out of their graves and walk around Jerusalem. There is no historical or external documentation, no corroborating evidence of this ever happening. This is pure mythology, not history. And that's the big difference between Tacitus and the Bible. While the Gospels may have been written at a time closer to when Jesus was alive, that closeness is not relevant weight in determining the accuracy of historical events. Tacitus has a massive amount of corroborative evidence. The Bible is contrasted by a plethora of evidence, including modern scientific and historical evidence. Given the extreme differences in the quality of the sources, I would say you're not just making an equivocation fallacy, you're making a gigantic category error. By these criteria, even John's gospel is not late by any means. The criteria you're using here, implying that earlier equals more reliable, is fundamentally flawed. Most scholars date John to around 90 to 110 CE, making this the last of the 4 canonical Gospels. It was written at least 60 years after Jesus' death and contains the most overt theological embellishments, which strongly suggest it reflects the evolution of the belief rather than first-hand memory. The chances of John being written by an eyewitness are vanishingly small. If the author were alive during Jesus' ministry, he would have been either a child at the time, unlikely to be a reliable observer, or so old by the time of his writing that his memory would be highly suspect. This is ignoring the fact that a 60-year-old memory would be dubious for anyone at any age. Additionally, the Gospel of John, like all Gospels, is anonymous. The name John was attached by later church tradition, not by the text itself. No internal claim of authorship exists, and there's no manuscript evidence identifying the author. Here's something crucial to understand. Age alone does not make a document unreliable, but neither does proximity make it true. What matters is the method of transmission, the intent behind the writing, and how well the claims can be corroborated. And considering Paul was written 20 years after the crucifixion, he is a very early source. Once again, early does not mean reliable. Just because Paul's letters were written within a few decades of Jesus' supposed crucifixion doesn't make them historically accurate. There are serious questions about Paul's relationship to Jesus, as well as his intentions and motivations. First, even the Bible acknowledges that Paul never met Jesus during his lifetime. His knowledge came not from first-hand interaction, but from visions, dreams, and what he called revelation. In Galatians 1:12, Paul emphasizes that his gospel didn't come from human sources. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ. Second, Paul shows very little interest in the historical Jesus. Across his authentic letters, he never mentions any of Jesus' parables, any specific miracles, Jesus' ministry timeline, his birthplace, baptism, or early teachings. Instead, Paul is focused almost entirely on theological meaning, especially Jesus' death and resurrection as cosmic salvation events. He treats Jesus as more like a divine archetype than a person with a biographical backstory. Third, Paul frequently writes about his own status, his treatment by churches, and what he received from them. While that's not inherently suspicious, it raises valid questions about whether Paul's motivations were purely spiritual, or if he also had personal or political incentives in shaping the early Christian message. Ultimately, Paul's letters are early, yes, but they're not eyewitness testimony and they lack biographical substance. His role was more like that of a theologian or propagator of a religious movement than a chronicler of historical events. We also have to know that Paul, Mark, and John did not get their accounts and information from each other, so we have multiple early independent sources for the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. This is a common apologetic talking point, but it doesn't hold up under historical scrutiny. Paul is not a narrative source. Paul's letters are the earliest Christian writings we have, yes, but they're not biographical accounts. Paul never met Jesus in his lifetime. He doesn't describe Jesus' ministry, miracles, parables, or life events, not even the crucifixion in narrative terms. His knowledge comes from visions and revelation, not eyewitness memory or investigative history. So calling Paul a source for Jesus' life is misleading. He's a theological voice, not a historical chronicler. Mark was likely written after Paul and may reflect Pauline theology. Mark is generally dated to around 70 CE, while Paul's authentic letters were written in the 50s. It's very likely the author of Mark was influenced by emerging Christian theology, especially the salvation focus on Jesus' death and resurrection found in Paul's writings. Mark doesn't cite Paul, but theological convergence suggests shared influence or a developing tradition. At the very least, Mark is not insulated from Pauline ideals. John is late and the least historically reliable. John's Gospel, usually dated from 90 to 110 CE, stands apart from the synoptics. It's not independent in any meaningful sense. It reflects a mature theological framework portraying Jesus as openly divine using symbolic I am statements and omitting much of the content found in earlier Gospels. John doesn't confirm Mark or Paul, it builds a different portrait altogether, shaped by decades of doctrinal development. Independence isn't just about authorship, it's about content and context. Even if 3 people write about the same event, their accounts are not independent if they draw from the same oral traditions, theological expectations, or community beliefs. What we see in the New Testament is not a series of detached journalistic investigations, it's a cluster of text produced within a shared faith community influenced by evolving doctrine and eternal tradition. Bottom line, Paul doesn't describe Jesus' life. Mark may be directly shaped by Pauline thought. John is theologically evolved and late. These are not 3 independent sources. They are theologically related writings from within a growing religious movement, and that distinction matters a lot when we're evaluating historical reliability. And there's more considering James, Jude, and the material unique to Matthew and Luke. If you don't believe Paul wrote the pastorals, you have other writers confirming Jesus and his death and resurrection. First, the Q-source hypothesis, which is one of the leading explanations in modern biblical scholarship, suggests that Matthew and Luke both drew from the now lost common source Q in addition to borrowing heavily from Mark. That means their content isn't fully independent. Their interdependence doesn't rely on the Q-source hypothesis being true either. They both already borrow word for word from Mark. Shared material and overlapping structure indicate they were working from common textual traditions, not distinct eyewitness testimony. As for James and Jude, these epistles contribute almost nothing in terms of biographical or narrative detail about Jesus' life, teachings, miracles, or crucifixion. They're primarily focused on internal church issues and moral exhortation, not historical accounts. Claiming they confirm the death and resurrection is stretching the term confirm beyond reasonable, honest use. Finally, just because multiple texts share similar theological conclusions, like belief in the resurrection, doesn't mean they're independent historical sources. What it more likely indicates is doctrinal convergence. These texts were written by members of a shared religious movement shaped by common beliefs, oral traditions, and early theological agendas. In short, overlapping theology does not equal independent corroboration. That is not how historical methodology works. Plus, we have 5,500 ancient Greek manuscripts, 10,000 ancient Latin, and a further 10,000 ancient manuscripts of other ancient languages of the New Testament. The number of manuscripts doesn't determine truth. It only shows popularity and preservation effort. Claiming that 5,500 Greek manuscripts and thousands more in Latin or other languages proves the New Testament's credibility is a category error. These are copies of copies, many written centuries after the originals, and they're riddled with variations, especially in passages dealing with critical doctrine, like the resurrection or the divinity of Jesus. In fact, no two manuscripts are exactly alike, and some of the most theologically charged verses, like the long ending of Mark, the woman caught in adultery, and the Trinitarian formula, are later insertions or absent from the earlier manuscripts. If sheer manuscript count were a measure of truth, then Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings would rank among the most credible accounts of historical events, because we have millions of consistent, well-preserved copies, but no one confuses fictional consistency with historical authenticity. And if simply retelling a story and writing it down made the story somehow more reliable, then fanfiction.net and DeviantArt would be more credible historical sources than the Bible. To quote biblical scholar Bart Ehrman, we have more variations than we have words in the New Testament. The quantity of manuscripts tells us how much people cared to copy and preserve a text. It does not tell us whether the events described in that text actually happen. The New Testament gets minute details right, with the names and geography and topography all corresponding to what we can confirm from the time. The Bible does not get minute details right. It gets mundane details right. And sometimes it doesn't even get those right, like the census of Quirinius, which completely misaligns with the actual historical timelines. Getting names of real places or referring to known customs isn't the same as verifying supernatural events. That's a basic category error. Even fiction gets mundane details right for verisimilitude to make the story feel grounded in a recognizable world. Now, you've tried to preempt the common Spider-Man analogy here, so let's bypass that. Instead, here's a more direct analogy. If I say I am a trans woman living in New York City that drinks coffee every morning and I'm secretly a billionaire, 3 of these statements are mundane and easily verifiable. The 4th is an extraordinary claim that requires extraordinary independent evidence. The fact that the first 3 statements are true does nothing to make the 4th one more likely. Correct mundane details do not transfer credibility to extraordinary ones. This is where your argument breaks down. You're committing the non sequitur fallacy. The conclusion, the supernatural claims the Bible are reliable, does not logically follow from the premise it gets some mundane details like names and geography right. Just because a text refers to real cities or uses common names doesn't make its theological or supernatural claims true. That's not how evidence works. If it were, every fantasy novel with a real map reference would count as history. This isn't Spider-Man in New York. This is a documentary about JFK. The claims that the New Testament is like a documentary about JFK is so wildly inaccurate that calling it a category error feels somehow wrong. I almost feel the need to invent a new logical fallacy just to process how wrong it is. We have contemporary documentation of JFK's assassination, video footage, photographs, live news coverage, police reports, autopsies, thousands of independent eyewitnesses, and archival materials stored across multiple media platforms, all recorded and preserved in real time. The event was seen live by millions of people, broadcast live, and investigated very publicly. In fact, it happened at the dawn of the 24-hour news cycle, when breaking news was a concept that was still breaking new ground. The JFK assassination is one of the most well-documented events in the 20th century. We don't rely on religious texts, oral traditions, or anonymous authors to know it happened. We rely on direct evidence produced at the time and by the people whose names we actually know. The New Testament, by contrast, was written decades after the events it describes by anonymous authors working from oral traditions and writing with a clear theological agenda. The earliest gospel was written at least 30 to 40 years after Jesus' death, and the latest canonical gospel was written possibly up to 70 years later. That is not contemporary documentation, that's folklore evolved to theology. And even with all the documentation surrounding JFK's death, conspiracy theories still managed to flourish despite photos, videos, forensic science, and eyewitnesses. If conspiracy and mythology can distort a real modern event with global visibility, how much more distortion can we expect after decades of oral storytelling in an ancient, pre-literate society? So no, the New Testament is not a documentary. It's not even a good ancient biography. It's closer to a spiritual conspiracy theory that was eventually canonized as sacred history. So, if you're going to trust 3 copies 800 years removed from when Tacitus wrote, you should trust the New Testament. This might be one of the most painfully misinformed statements I've encountered online, and I've been on the internet since before BBSs were a thing. You're committing a classic false equivalence fallacy. Tacitus never claimed supernatural events. He was a Roman historian reporting on politics, wars, and imperial behavior, not divine resurrection, walking on water, or ascensions into the sky. The New Testament makes what is arguably the most extraordinary metaphysical claim in human history: that a man died, came back to life, and ascended into heaven, violating all known laws of biology, physics, and experience. These aren't the same kinds of claims, and they don't require the same standard of evidence. More importantly, trust isn't transitive. Believing Tacitus about Nero doesn't require you to believe that Jesus rose from the dead just because both are ancient sources. Historical credibility is evaluated on a case-by-case basis, not by blanket equivalency. As David Hume's maxim states, no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. Even then, Hume notes, there is a mutual destruction of arguments, and we're left with only the most plausible explanation surviving the comparison. Or, as Carl Sagan so brilliantly put it, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Here's the problem. The extraordinary claims of the Bible are never supported by extraordinary evidence. They're supported by secondhand, anonymous sources written decades later, full of internal contradictions and entirely lacking external corroboration. So no, if you trust Tacitus about Nero, it means you're willing to trust mundane claims corroborated by archaeology and independent records. If you want to trust the New Testament's supernatural claims, you'll need to bring evidence that matches the magnitude of the claim, and that simply doesn't exist. There's no circular reasoning here. This is circular reasoning, by definition. Your claim essentially boils down to the New Testament is true because it says so, and because we have lots of copies that all say it's true. That's not evidence, that's a self-referential loop. The fallacy arises when you use the Bible to validate itself, or cite biblical authors whose only source are other biblical authors. The quantity of manuscripts or internal agreement doesn't fix that. It just means you're copying the same unverified claim across time. In historical analysis, what matters is external confirmation, independent evidence that can be used to test the claim being made. And outside of a few mundane, non-miraculous details, like place names or titles of Roman officials, the Bible's supernatural claims stand completely uncorroborated. So yes, it is circular reasoning, stacked high and duplicated often, but still a circle. And thank you for sitting through this one, folks. Unfortunately, my throat is absolutely killing me today, so I hope I was able to make it to the end and you could tolerate it. Thank you so much for joining me. Please feel free to join me on my Discord, or if you could be so kind, contribute to my Ko-fi account. It goes a really long way to helping me produce these and keeping me motivated to keep the intellectual discourse going. Until next time, we'll talk to you later.